let me tell you, when you're spending all your time in the duplex that you're renovating, you suddenly realize how much you hate your duplex. Just kidding. I do love it.
Welcome to the Thought Feeder podcast. I'm Joel Goodman here, as always, with John Steven Stansel, and we have a very special guest. Our good friend Erin Supinka is going to join us today, and we're so happy to have you, Erin. Thanks for coming on the pod.
I'm so excited to be here. I've been listening since I think day one, and I just
Woohoo!
really like what you two are doing.
Well,
Thank
we're
you.
big fans of your work as well, and we recently asked some questions to our audience, and one of the biggest responses we got, what people want to hear, is some advice for people starting out in the field of social media and digital marketing and higher ed. And we thought you would be the perfect person to bring on, just because really, I think your career has been a meteoric rise from when you first started doing social media to where you are today. And I remember the first time we met in person at High Ed Web in Sacramento, and just sitting down and talking to you, I was just blown away by not just the wealth of knowledge you have on the topic of social media and higher ed, but of working in higher ed and getting everybody on board and working together, which can be one of the biggest challenges of the job. So we'll start with the basic question. I mean, what advice do you have for those folks who are just getting their start, just got hired at a university in these unprecedented times? And,
Hey, but do you know that we've had another pandemic, so it's not unprecedented.
right.
There is precedent for this.
But specifically, how can those starting out just navigate some of the university politics and actually get, not just get work done, get good work done that they can be proud of?
Can I talk a little bit about my background? Is that helpful?
Of course.
Please do.
I just feel like it's useful. So I started into higher ed right out of college. So I left my job as an undergraduate at my alma mater and knew that I wanted to get into higher ed marketing, social media. And so, back in 2014, that was a newer position. And so you weren't seeing as many pop up. And so I was just looking and digging around and looking at what was available. And what that kind of helped me realize was the variety of structures that existed in higher ed when it came to marketing and communications, namely being that marketing did not exist in many, many universities' directories or any form of communication that they had out there. It was usually public affairs, communication, etc. And so that kind of immediately tipped me off to, okay, so that's maybe not a word that we use in this space. And then the other bit is that I am a short female that is very bubbly and honestly looks like I'm 12. And so most of my life, I've had to kind of come into the situation and convince people that, no, I'm here seriously. I'm a serious human, I swear. And so those two pieces kind of have always been in the back of my head. And so when I first started at my job now at Dartmouth, one of the things I quickly realized was that the space that I was entering, there was a lot of good intentioned people. Like, people knew that social was important or valued what was happening online. It was just bringing them into a conversation where they understood what that meant. And so, at a lot of the conversations that I have with people, we talk about how we're the first people in our university or institution that is doing our type of job. And that's something that I always like to remind people, is that you have to do a lot of education, and you have to come at it from a way that isn't talking down to someone. One thing that I always tell people to do is, when you come into a new situation, you always see all of the mistakes or all of the things that you think could be done better. What you don't have is that context of why we're at that situation. And so, that's something that I've always kind of talked to people about is, when you go in and you're analyzing a situation, or you're like, I do a lot of audits for people. And so, when I'm writing up my audit, I try not to attack something as just a poor idea. I try to say, like, so I noticed you do this, and I'm curious, what the background of this is. Is this something that you've tested out before and you noticed that this worked better for your audiences, etc.? Because the other really quirky thing about social is that there is not one size fits all in this industry. And so something that technically goes against best practices could actually work really well for a particular audience or the audience your institution is dealing with. And so the first kind of big pieces of advice that I like to tell people is, one, prepare to be an educator, and kind of, save up materials that help break down what you're doing, that talk about it, so that, one, you're not the only voice in the room, so that they can see, like, hey, this is not what Erin thinks, this is what industry thinks. And then also working with them to understand the context of decisions that have been made and reasons that things have been moving forward in a certain way, so that you're not unintentionally causing tension in a situation because you're coming in as a new person, a new set of eyeballs, and just ripping apart an idea that maybe someone cared a lot about and is really upset that it didn't come together the way they thought it would come together, or they maybe don't know another option is available. And so those are the two really big pieces of advice that I try to tell people, because I've dealt with people that come in and say all these things, and then when they hear the reasons of why decisions have been made, they usually are on the same page and say, "Oh, okay." And then now we can come together and figure out actually a solution to a problem versus, "Ooh, awkward, not going to work here."
I've had a lot of really similar experience. When I worked specifically at a university with that whole like relationship management side of things, right? I mean, this is good advice for any time you're working with other people. You generally don't want to make them feel stupid or bad about themselves or like that they're wrong. Um, you can explain that in a lot of different ways. Some of it's power dynamics, like, cool, if everyone feels good about themselves and you make them feel good about themselves, you have a little bit more power in the situation. But I think, if you're a nicer person than I am, then you would think of it just in terms of, this is how cooperation works, right? Like, when everyone is happy, everyone works together. And I think, I learned very similar lessons as I got into higher ed, and had a different path than you did, Aaron. But like, I got into higher ed pretty much right after college, and a lot of it was, okay. I worked for my alma mater, and I was like, I'm glad I made those relationships with these people when I was a student doing different leadership things, and now I need to just be careful to develop those in different ways, so that I mean, because in some ways similar to you, I think anyone that comes into a position as a young adult coming just out of school, you're gonna get a little bit of that. Well, for me, like at my alma mater, I knew him as a student. He's still a student. That's just kind of the mentality sitting there. You had the short, bubbly female thing working against you at a new school, and and just being youthful in general. Um, it's interesting to try and find ways to. I think the education part is interesting, because it does kind of establish you as someone who's thoughtful and thinking through what you're doing, and then if you can manage those relationships around you, it's even better.
Yeah. And I think that's something that comes up just in social media in general. People assume that whoever's in that social media manager position is an intern or
Mm.
um, less experienced, let's say. I am not, uh, the word bubbly would never be used to describe me, but, you know, people's demeanor changes dramatically versus emails I have prior to a meeting to after the meeting, when I come in and I'm very professional and knowledgeable about my topic and whatnot, and they go, "Oh, wait a second, you're not just somebody we brought in off the street to run social media. You're not just somebody's nephew with a cell phone. You know what you're
You're a
doing."
real human with, like, training in this area.
Right.
Exactly. Uh, so yeah, I think that's something we all have to overcome, and that takes time, but it also takes doing that outreach and talking to people, and back to what you were saying, Aaron, definitely education.
So, what are some specific ways, or I guess specific techniques that you've found to be helpful in terms of forging those relationships, and helping kind of like foster that sense of collaboration, and that sense of it's helping people find value in the work that they've done, while also helping them to think how they can always be improving. I think smart people always want to be improving themselves in general, and they want other people to think in those terms too, as we recognize that we're never at that level of perfection. But what's worked well for you in terms of fostering those relationships?
One of the big things that I always do both in my professional and personal life is that I try to maintain the relationships outside of the asks. And so that's something that I've noticed, and unfortunately it can be a side effect of higher ed in general because so many of us are stretched
Yeah.
thin, is that the only interactions that you have with a coworker or a colleague is whenever you need something from them or they need something from you. And so, I set up monthly meetings with a lot of our main brand managers around campus, so people manage the library accounts, the art centers, etc., so that even if we didn't have something to talk about specifically at that meeting, we would still have it, and grab coffee and just kind of sometimes commiserate about what's like frustrating us with the career, because so many of us were the only person in our area that dealt with what we did. And so those meetings kind of also turned into an opportunity to catch up on best practices, just generally to share examples we've seen from institutions or even outside of industry, and just kind of an opportunity to check in and be with one another. Connecting with someone that is doing what you do is beyond validating, which I know you two know very well. Um, and so it's maintaining those relationships where and when you can, even if it's just a quick check-in. That's something that I've been trying to do during all of this COVID stuff, particularly is, at the beginning of every email, I'm not just jumping right into, hey, I need this from you, or I was wondering if you could, or what are you doing about this. I'm saying like, hey, I hope this email finds you and your loved ones healthy and well. These are wild times, please let me know how I can help. And then I always end it with, again, saying like, stay safe, take care. If there's anything I can do to help, or if this is a lot for you to take on right now, please just let me know, and I'm happy to like figure out another solution. Because the thing that I am grateful for about this pandemic, which is interesting to say, and I always feel kind of a little weird, is that we're able to now see people with their different labels. And so, you're having a meeting with someone while they're also bouncing their child on their lap to keep them entertained during the day because
Right.
their partner is on a phone call with their business. And so that's been something that's been really eye-opening to me, and I'm trying to incorporate that more and more into, okay, I'm notorious for sending emails after hours because if I think of something, I have to send it or else I'll forget. And so what I've been trying to do is, if I'm on my desktop or my laptop, I try and schedule it for the next day during work hours if it's not an emergency, or it's not information someone's waiting on me for, just so that they're not getting a notification and feeling, even if it's not something they have to respond to, they feel pulled into that moment. Or if I'm sending it from my phone, which I haven't found a good way to schedule that from my phone, I put my poor social media manager, Breland, it has received so many of these, and it's usually in caps. You do not need to read this right now. This is not important at all. This is just a random thought I had, and I needed to get onto paper before I forgot. And like, that's the subject line, because I don't want them to feel like, okay, I not only am I required to be doing work after hours, but I need to be checking even if there isn't something going on, in the event that something pops up, because I have a way to reach them in the case of an emergency. And so I don't want these emails and these little interactions to be seen as after hour asks when they're really not. It's just because I'm a forgetful person, and when an idea comes to me, I have to get it out, or else who knows when it'll come back. And so that's been very specific for me, is remembering that these people are humans, and even if something weird happens or there's awkward tension, that there's a million reasons why that could have been awkward, or like a weird moment, and that most of the time it probably has nothing to do with you. It could be that they are getting pressure from somewhere else in their job or from home or whatever, and that it just came out in a shorter answer to you, or they're running doing a million things, and so their email was three words versus their normal um, longer email. And so that those are the two things, is maintaining those connections outside of just the ask, and then also remembering people are human, and even if it isn't an ask, maintaining that human connection, that you're kind of in this together, and you both realize that there's a lot being asked of you, or there's a lot going on, and you both are trying to work together to usually a similar conclusion or solution.
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially right now, everybody working remotely and kind of on different time schedules. And I think as so many of us are new to working remotely, there's a lot of pressure to be responsive when we get that to let our supervisors know, hey, we're here, we're paying attention. I've got my phone out while walking to my mailbox.
Yeah.
Um, But I think it is good to have supervisors set those reasonable expectations and say, that this is not, I'm sending it to you now, but don't deal with it now. Like that sort of, that level of communication, I think is very important. Or even just a Slack message. Like if you can't get back to somebody right away,
Oh,
you kind of chat back and forth, and then suddenly there's like a giant gap because somebody, that's happened to me, they need to go tend to the 3-year-old for a little bit, and there's a gap in there, just a little quick little BRB, back to that,
yeah.
those ICQ
AOL Instant Messenger.
early 2000s chat abbreviations. We need to bring some of those
Honestly,
back. Like I just a little AFK.
I don't want to even tally how many hours I spent designing my away messages and info
Oh
like
yes.
during that time period. That
Oh
was like my
yes.
favorite time of my life was like, oh, I'm going to do rainbow colors and all these things. That be like the other thing is that like you were just mentioning how you like people sometimes disappear for a little while. I am notorious for typing out a message and then never hitting send. Like I've gone back to text messages or emails, or I'll close out my email for the day and I'll like close all my windows and there will be 3 emails or 3 text messages or whatever that I just never hit send on because I in the middle of it and a notification caught my attention, or something happened behind me that like drew me away, and the next thing I know it's buried. um and so like that's the other thing that I like have kind of been really clear with my team about is that if I haven't gotten back to you on something, please ping me because there's a very good chance that it's sitting right there and I did not hit send, or that like it got buried in a bunch of other emails and I don't want to hold you up because, a lot of the times what they need from me is a quick review or a quick kind of like looks good, let's go with this, or yes, this is right, or no, let's try this. So it takes totally like 5 minutes, but those things typically will get buried in email. So that's the other piece of it is figuring out that system of how do I appropriately ping someone again to re-engage them. And I do want to say that if you're on the flip side of a relationship and you're not a supervisor and you're having trouble figuring out where kind of the boundaries are, don't be afraid to ask. That's been something that I know that I've talked to my team about is saying, if there's ever something that you're unclear about, or if I'm doing something that give like I don't not anxiety, but makes you feel like you have to respond and we may not be on the same page about something, like please let me know. Like please set the pace and let me know what is reasonable for you and what makes sense for me, and I will then meet you and compromise and say like, okay, this makes sense, but I do need to switch with you on and off for after hours and stuff like that. And so don't be afraid to lead that conversation because again, for a lot of us, we're working with people that don't know truly how marketing or social media works. And so, like, when we say that we're on 24/7, we mean that we're on 24/7. If we're not checking, like, even if we're not checking our phone, like John said, we have it in our pocket on the way to the mailbox. Or, like, for me, I answer a lot of emails when I'm like on a walk or just like walking to the kitchen. And so, I just am always I have it ready and always on. Um, and that's a habit I've developed because of the way social media interacts and works within my life. And so being able to set those boundaries and work with your supervisor to bring them on board and to a better understanding of what that looks like in your life will help them set way better um, boundaries for both of you, and it'll increase their mindfulness of it in the moments when things are happening.
Yeah, especially as we're going through, so many varieties. Right now, I've got one group on Slack, a group me, how many Slack channels, Basecamp, ClickUp, yeah, some people want to use email, I've got one guy that's just texting me, getting everybody on board with streamlining some of these communications can be really difficult, and knowing what people's preferences are and remembering
Oh
that
yeah.
is just, it's too much for a lot of people to handle.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears here for a second. And one thing, we're recording this on a Wednesday. You've got a webinar tomorrow, which this podcast probably won't be out in time to promote,
It
but
might be.
It's actually later today.
oh,
Oh, then it
It's
definitely won't be out. No.
Come on.
what day is it
It'll
again?
be out tomorrow.
There's one today that I'm hosting for my college, and then I am doing one tomorrow
Oh, there you go.
for EDU Web.
So that segues very well, because I'm gonna say you do a lot of webinars and conferences, and you put
Yes.
yourself out there professionally. You do podcasts like this one. And you've gone quickly from being a fresh voice in the field to a leading expert. And I think you're putting yourself out there with presenting at conferences and these webinars and these sort of things outside your regular job duties. And I think that's very important, not just professionally, but specifically in higher ed, where we're working with a lot of people that are of the mindset of publish or perish. A lot of faculty who, you present, you share your knowledge. So that can be a little intimidating to people just starting out in the field, but I advocate for it, and I think it's really important. How do you encourage your team to take part in sharing their knowledge with the greater professional community?
For me, it's always been a great way to get my thoughts onto paper. So that's something that, like you said, publish or perish. Like that's something that these things will sit in my brain and I will think them and I will like, and work them out in my head and figure out all these different things. But I won't put them onto paper because for the longest time, again, I was the only person. So there was no one that really needed them except for me. And so as long as they were in my head or jotted down on a notebook, like I was good to go. And so with presentations and conferences, that forced me to kind of organize my thoughts in a way that even if I wasn't selected to speak, helped me process and kind of nail down what exactly the like nut graph of my project or this idea or this strategy or policy was, which to me was incredibly helpful. So that's like my number one thing is see conference proposals and opportunities to talk about your work as a way to boil it down to what is really driving what you're doing. For instance, I was just on a webinar last week, and even though I've been talking about it a lot, it didn't click to me until I was talking through it, practicing for that webinar, was that a lot of what I'm doing right now is social care and thinking about our audiences and trying not to overwhelm them or overstimulate them with information that they may not need to know. So we're boiling down exactly what we need to get out there. So we're not just adding another place of content that, is only maybe sometimes relevant to me. And so until I had that like practice session, I hadn't it was in there. Like that's what we were doing, but I hadn't put words to it. And so the conferences and the webinars really helped me with that. And then the other bit of it is, and this is totally selfish, but it helps me connect with, first of all, like people like you. Like I would not have been going to conferences had I not started one attending them and just getting a feel for them, but also just submitting to talk, because a lot of the times, it made it more accessible for me to go speaking or volunteering. So that's another thing that I think conferences and webinars really help out with is connecting you with people that then when you're off the air or you're not presenting, you have the opportunity to open up another conversation and just for instance, like Meg Bernier Kenningston from St. Lawrence. I met her when I was presenting at a conference 2013, I want to say, and like our relationship has become so wonderful over the course of the year, and we mostly only interact at conferences. And so it's another opportunity in my experience to interact and get more resources. And so that's been kind of the two driving forces behind it. And the other thing that I like to say is that especially in higher ed, our campuses and our universities are so unique and our audiences are so unique, even though, there is a lot of similarities that we can quickly identify, that your story and your work and your information is most likely different than mine. And what you're doing is different than what I'm doing, whether it's slightly or a big difference. And I will always be able to learn something from you because your audience and the way that you approach things and the goals of your institution, although probably sound similar, are different than mine. And so you always have something to offer someone to learn from you. And so that's the other thing, is that that's a really great part of higher ed, is that everything is so different and the same at the exact same time, that you can offer advice about what you're doing and someone can hear it and think about it and process it and then take it back to their own universities and apply it in a different way, but a way that makes sense to their university and audience.
Well, Erin, you and I met at Confab EDU because we were moderating a session room or whatever, like a track room or something like
Yeah.
that.
Oh yeah. I've been around the conference world. That's the other thing. I volunteer all the time because that also gets me an opportunity to just attend and see the behind the scenes and meet new people. So like volunteering met you.
Yeah.
It's blast.
Well, I think one of the things that a lot of a lot of us on the outside, that aren't you,
Yeah.
notice about you is that you do have confidence, and I think that's probably something that goes to that third point that you made. It's that I think people talk a lot about imposter syndrome in higher ed. I'm not a person that struggles with that personally very often at all.
I appreciate your honesty in that.
But I think I think part of it, and when I've taught college classes in the past, or I think even different conference talks that I've given, a lot of times I try to instill this value of, or this message of, you have value, the stuff that you think about has value, the stuff that you do has value. It just takes a little bit of confidence and a little bit of courage to go out and start talking about it. and
Yeah.
and those are the things that, going back to your first point within this, like you were saying, when we teach stuff, when we talk about the stuff that we have been thinking about, that we've been working through, that we have been practicing, and especially when we're sharing that with others, it's a teaching process, and we do find out a lot more of, or we find new ways to talk about the stuff that we've been doing. And I think there's teachers always talk about how they learn more from teaching their students than they think their students learn from them, and that sort of a thing. And I've definitely found the same true when I'm putting together a talk. It a lot of times either generates a lot more thoughts in a totally different direction, and it opens up some new pathways to thinking about and practicing the work that I do. But I think it also is one of those things that very much teaches me how to better communicate with people. It helps me formalize and condense, or yeah, I guess condense what I'm thinking already, so that I can be a little bit more precise, and leaves a lot more room, hopefully, to more clearly communicate the work that I'm doing to people. So I think, yeah, I think those are all super valuable. I think all of that comes along with a very, just trying to find a little bit of confidence to believe in yourself, you know?
And I will say that one of the best ways to gain that confidence is to have a conversation with someone that is either at your institution and kind of far enough away
Hmm.
from you that they wouldn't have kind of insider knowledge of if what you're doing, so that if you say something and it doesn't quite make sense, they can't fill in the blanks, is to have a conversation with someone in the space and kind of just say, hey, and I'm happy to be that for anyone. Like, if you ever want to run through an idea and talk through a proposal, I am more than happy to listen. um this totally comes from, like, I think my FOMO and some other things, but I like being an insider, so I'm always happy to listen. And so, I'm it's good to run it through with someone else, and even just one person to provide a little bit of feedback. Like, I'll say, like, I shared an office with this wonderful woman named Hannah for most of my career at Dartmouth, and we just recently broke up, but that's okay. Um, and I would literally just read her emails. I would say, this is what I'm thinking about saying, and she'd say, that sounds good, but that doesn't sound good. Or if I was hemming and hawing about something, she'd be like, okay, stop it, you know that you can do this. And it was like the most useful, like, little voice on my shoulder that I had to, like, literally shut up all of the imposter syndrome, because I definitely struggle with that. And she just come in and say, no, what's wrong with you? Like, she would yell at me and I would yell at her. That was our relationship. So we would just make sure that the other one realized what they really were worth, and that they weren't getting in their own way. And if we had to be a little bit argumentative slash aggressive about it, we were fine with that because it worked for us. But it's really good to have that just even one other person to kind of go to regularly and say, like, can you gut check me on this? Is this right? Is this wrong? Or am I overthinking things?
And while we're on the topic of imposter syndrome, let's talk about that. But what I think is one of the leading causes of imposter syndrome among social media folks in higher ed, and one of the biggest frustrations that I hear about, and I have personally sometimes when I talk to folks who I admire and I look up to, you, like you, Aaron, and others in higher ed, that while they might be speaking to like packed rooms at conferences and winning red staplers and writing posts and go and for industry publications and going on podcasts, and I sit down and talk to them, they all have the same complaint that while their work is amazing, they have trouble getting people at their own university to listen to them and take their advice. How do we get around that? There's that somebody described it to me recently as the 100-mile rule, that sometimes university leadership won't listen to you unless you come from 100 miles away or being paid $100,000 to you know. Uh, so how do we get our own leadership, and not when I say leadership, I don't just mean the president, but and provost, but all the way down to like director level to listen and take our advice sometimes.
I think it goes a bit back to what Joel said with the confidence, and that's something that is definitely a learned thing that I've had, and what that kind of has helped me do is since beginning at Dartmouth, I tried to get into as many meetings that I thought would be helpful or informational to me, and I wouldn't always speak. I would just listen and consume information so that whenever I would have a conversation, I would have that background information so that they didn't feel like I didn't ask, not, I don't want to say a stupid question, but kind of a question that the answer could have been easily found or they felt that I should know. And so I tried to alleviate that by just kind of consuming and embracing as much knowledge, which helped me, I think, definitely um, start to get more involved in things because I already had knowledge and they didn't have to bring me up to speed in meetings. The other thing that I really try to do when it comes to getting buy-in is come prepared, and I've talked about this a little bit in my different conference talks, is that it's again really useful to bring information that is relevant not only from yourself but from outside sources. Prepare some sort of example. So one of the biggest hurdles that I come across is people not being unable to envision what you're talking about. And so if you can find an example that kind of lends itself to what you're talking about, or even puts a mock-up together very quickly, that's super helpful. And I think there's still going to be those hurdles that you come up against where they still want to take the advice of an expert that's outside. You can see it, but I put air quotations, that's outside of your institution, because people rightfully put weight behind an outside perspective, but also that takes away the insider knowledge that you have of your institution. And I think it's really important to also keep track of your wins. And so that's something that I've started for myself, as well as I've encouraged my team to start, is that when something you do does well, take a screenshot of it. Or if someone comments back and says, wow, this is exactly what I needed, or this is everything that I really asked for, take a screenshot of it and keep a folder. And then that way, whenever you're either doubting yourself or there's questions about expertise, you can say, hey, I've done something like this before for this institution or for another institution, and here's the responses that I got. Because I found that, like, when I wanted to bring that up, I would have to go dig for it, and by the time I would dig it up, it would be like, oh, missed my chance. But if I'm able to provide those examples quickly, I was able to demonstrate that, hey, I'm not just pulling this out of wherever. I'm actually speaking on experience that you may not have had the chance to learn about me. And so those have been successful for me. But I will say the biggest kind of reminder is that when you're at a conference, you're in a room of people that understand what you do. And when you're back in your home office, you're surrounded by people who kind of know what you do or may know a little bit more about what you do. But generally, that education piece, like, it just keeps coming back to education, is educating where you can and when you can about the work that we're doing, so that when those moments come up, they've started to kind of associate you with, oh, video, I go to this person for that, or oh, social, I go to JS for that. And so that's been the most successful, is trying to align my name with these topics on campus through that education piece.
That's awesome.
Oh, jinx.
Oh, this has been great.
Yeah, Erin, thank you so much. I have learned a ton, especially things I can take back and use in some of the relationship building I'm trying to do on campus and continue to do. And it's something personally I know I struggle with sometimes. So getting your perspective has been really super valuable.
And again, thank you so much for having me. I've been trying to get out and do other things that aren't related to COVID, because I feel like that's consumed my life. And so this has been these things have been such a breath of fresh air for me.
Erin, thank you so much for being with us as well. We enjoyed it, and I think honestly your insights will help a lot of the folks that have been asking us, what do I do when I'm new? Like, how do I gain ground?
I picked up a lot that I can use as well. So thank you.
As always, a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you for having me.
As always, thank you for listening to the Thought Feeder podcast. If you don't subscribe yet, please visit thoughtfeederpod.com. If you don't follow us on Twitter, we're at ThoughtFeedPod. You can also follow me personally at Joel Goodman and my co-host John Steven Stansel at JS Stansel on Twitter. Thought Feeder is hosted by Joel Goodman and John Steven Stansel and edited by Joel Goodman. You can find Thought Feeder wherever you get your podcasts. Thought Feeder is sponsored by University Insight.